How's it going, everyone? Landon with LMR.com. In this video, we're going to be showing you guys a general walkthrough on how to install an On3 single turbo kit into your Fox Mustang. First things first here, guys, if you are wanting to know a little bit more on the specifics of the On3 single turbo kit, be sure and check out the link in the video description. In that video, I explain the kit in its entirety and go over all of the components that the kit includes. Now for this video, we are going to strictly be talking about the installation of the On3 kit for the 5-liter based engine. For any of you installing the On3 kit for a 5.8-liter based engine, the steps in this video should be similar. If you're going to be installing either one of these kits by yourself, I highly recommend that you have very good mechanical ability and a strong understanding on how turbo systems work. A good tool selection will help out, as well as a friend with very good mechanical knowledge as well. The car we are going to be installing the kit into is our little 88 coupe that you guys have probably seen in our other videos. This car first debuted in the AOD to T5 swap series and has since been featured in our manual rack conversion video, the Team ZK member video, and of course, the Bad to the Bone Pro-M EFI management system video. Depending on the amount of boost you plan on running, you are going to have to address the fuel system to meet your needs. Other than that, it already has 47-pound injectors installed and of course a 190 liter per hour fuel pump, which is going to be ideal for 6 pounds of boost. Before installing this turbo kit, it is going to be in your best interest to perform an entire once-over over the entire car. This is now a good time to watch our mod prep video, and that can be found in the description as well. Keep in mind, there will be several times during the install where parts will be mocked up and then removed. This is going to help you verify accuracy and help in the final fit and finish of all of the components. All right, enough of me talking. We're gonna get the car on the dyno and establish some baseline numbers before we install the On3 kit. This 88 coupe does have GT40 heads, an Explorer upper and lower intake, an unknown camshaft, stock headers with an SVE off-road X-pipe, and a very old Flowmaster American Thunder Cat Back exhaust, and as far as we know, it's still a true 302 that has not been bored or stroked. For the dyno pull, the car will have 93 octane fuel, and the T5 is going to be in 4th gear so that we have a 1-to-1 ratio. Our baseline numbers were pretty solid considering what the car has. This car made 250 horsepower at 5,000 RPMs and 284 foot-pounds of torque at 3,800 RPMs. So you guys know as well as I do, let's install a turbo kit.
All right, so first things first, you're going to support the car as high as you can get it with jack stands or a lift. From here you can remove the front wheels, inner fender splash shields, and the front bumper. If you would like to know the proper steps to remove your inner fender splash shield and front bumper, check out our detailed video in the description. Of course, don't forget to disconnect the negative battery cable. With the bumper removed, remove the 8 half-inch bolts securing the crash bar to the core support. There are 4 of these per side. I then remove the cold air intake. Be sure and disconnect the mass airflow sensor if it's equipped. On the passenger side of the engine, remove the plug wires from the spark plugs. You can lay these on top of the intake manifold. Spray a penetrating oil onto the header retaining bolts. Go ahead and repeat these steps for the driver's side. Disconnect the coil wire and lay it on top of the intake manifold as well. From underneath the car, loosen and remove the O2 sensors with the 7/8 open-end wrench. Since our car utilizes wide bands because of the Pro-M standalone ECU, we simply unscrewed our sensors with the pigtail still attached. Of course, if you don't have wide bands, you can easily just disconnect the electrical connections. Loosen and remove the mid-pipe to header retaining hardware. Now you can loosen and remove the mid-pipe to cat back hardware. If you have a 3-piece mid-pipe installed, loosen the intermediate piping hardware. At this time, the existing mid-pipe can be removed. Now you can remove the passenger side header bolts. These should be 7/16. Take your time here, as the workroom around the flange and primary is fairly tight. With the bolts removed, the passenger side header is now free to come out. Do the same for the driver's side. You will need to loosen the bolt securing the dipstick first. Go ahead and take this time to remove the dipstick altogether. It easily removes from the engine block by pulling up to release the O-ring at the bottom. Now you can remove the driver's side header. Remove all 8 of the spark plugs with the 5/8" spark plug socket. Now is also a good time to remove the starter for added working room. Loosen and remove the bolt securing the starter cable to the starter. Loosen and remove the top bolt with a 9/16 socket. Hold the starter with one hand and then remove the bottom 9/16 bolt. The starter can now be set aside. Disconnect the alternator electrical connection. Release tension on the belt tensioner with an 18mm socket and breaker bar. Remove the belt from the car. To remove the alternator, loosen and remove the 2 attaching bolts. Because the On3 kit includes an adjustable alternator bracket, the tensioner is no longer needed. Loosen and remove the retaining nut, and then the tensioner is free to come out. The factory alternator bracket will also be removed. In order to access one of the retaining bolts, the heater return hose must be temporarily positioned out of the way. You may need to drain a little coolant from the system before doing this. Loosen and remove any associated bolts retaining the alternator bracket to the engine block. Reinstall the hose back onto the water pump. For the most part, this is the consensus of the uninstall. Throughout the install process, there will probably be additional parts that need to be removed, relocated, or temporarily positioned out of the way to make life easier. To begin the mock-up of the kit, lay all of your turbo components out on the floor related to their like position on the car. We're starting with the hot side piping. We took the time to use some DEI header wrap and wrap all of the hot side components. This included the downpipe that exits the turbine as well. Metal cable ties were used to secure the header wrap. On3 recommends using OEM motorcraft plugs gapped at 28 thousandths. You may consider a colder plug if you have extensive engine modification or will be running a decent amount of boost. Once the plugs are gapped, apply some anti-seize to the threads and then reinstall them into the cylinder heads. Since the On3 kit requires the removal of the smog pump, use our 5/0 resto plugs in the back of the cylinder head to plug the ports. Apply a thread locking compound with sealer to the threads. Install them into the ports on the back of the cylinder heads and then run them down with a quarter or something similar. Clean any leftover gasket material from the exhaust ports on the heads. Of course, be sure and blow away or wipe up any debris. The next several steps that will be shown are going to involve mocking up the hot side and prepping other components for final install. I highly recommend you have this same mentality when installing your kit. Install the passenger side manifold and tighten the frontward and rearward retaining bolts. Place the turbo on a workbench and loosen the 1/2" bolts on the compressor. Tighten at least one of these bolts so that the compressor doesn't rotate. Do the same for the turbine. The final clocking will be done with the turbo mounted to the header. At this time, you can install the drain and supply fittings. The oil drain is obviously going to be on the bottom. Wipe the mating surface with brake clean and a rag. Apply blue thread locking compound to the retaining bolts. Position the correct gasket into place, followed by the plate. Thread one of the retaining bolts in by hand. The barbed fitting has an O-ring at the base, so thread locking compound is not needed. Install it into the plate. Thread in the other plate retaining bolt and torque each of these retaining bolts to approximately 16 pound-feet. Tighten the barbed fitting by hand and then rotate an additional flat. Apply blue thread locking compound to the Allen head cap bolts. Wipe the mating surface and then position the correct gasket into place. Position the plate over the gasket and install one of the bolts. Locate the 90-degree fitting. Apply thread sealer to the tapered threads. Install it into the plate and rotate it in a way so that you can install the other Allen head cap bolt. Torque each of the cap bolts to approximately 88 inch-pounds. Rotate the 90-degree fitting until it becomes snug. Then rotate until it is facing the direction of the oil pressure sending unit. Install the braided supply onto the fitting and verify that it does not come in contact with the cap bolt. If it does, rotate the 90-degree fitting until it is able to spin freely. Install the provided oil drain hose over the barbed fitting. Since we had our AC system drained, the 2 lines connected to the condenser were removed for mock-up. Quick disconnect line tools will do the trick. Either position the upper radiator hose out of the way, or just simply remove it altogether. Clean the turbo and manifold mating surfaces. Position the gasket into place and loosely tighten the retaining hardware. I brought the bolts up through the bottom of the manifold. To me, this seemed easier to do than going from the top down. Of course, reference the instructions for proper placement of the oil drain pan fitting. Position the fuel lines out of the way. Loosen and remove the bolt securing the starter cable support bracket to the engine block. Position this out of the way. Mark the spot on the oil pan per the instructions. Double and triple check your measurement. Once the mark has been placed, circle the area. Remove any paint and or coating from the oil pan. Since the mark is now gone from cleaning the paint and or coating, measure it again just to be sure. Use an oil pan punch that has a 5/8 inch base. Place the punch over the mark and strike it with a hammer. Once a hole is made, use a screwdriver or something similar to check for oil pump clearance. Once that is verified, hammer the punch into the pan until the base of the punch is flush with the pan. Source a 3/8 18 NPT tap and supply grease to the threads and flutes. Ensure that the tap is centered within the opening and then rotate a few turns. Back it out and wipe up any metal shavings from the oil pan. Clean away the shavings from the tap as well. Once clean, apply fresh grease and continue tapping the pan. A few extra turns is all you should need. Remove the tap and then thoroughly clean the pan. Apply thread sealer to the oil pan fitting. Tighten it down until it becomes snug. Rotate an additional full turn or 6 flats. Before installing the driver's side manifold, remove the factory oil filter. Now you can install the header and hold it in place with the frontward and rearward bolt. Take this time to check clutch cable and K-member clearance. The particular car we were working on had badly deteriorated rubber engine mounts, which was causing the manifold to come in contact with the K-member. A set of our 5.0 Resto engine mounts solved this problem. Position the correct exhaust crossover pipe onto the passenger side exhaust manifold. Loosely install a V-band clamp. With the assistance from a friend, position the driver's side exhaust crossover pipe into place. Loosely install a V-band clamp. Align the ball and socket connection and loosely install the provided hardware. At this time, you can snug down the V-band clamps and the hardware. Remove the electrical connection from the oil pressure sending unit. Loosen the sending unit fitting while supporting the oil pressure extension with a crescent or open end wrench. Unscrew the sending unit and remove it. Without applying thread sealer, we mocked up the assembly for the oil pressure and supply line. This is very straightforward. Mock yours up first as well and then remove it. Apply thread sealer to the crossover block and then thread it into the sending unit extension. Snug the block down and then rotate until it's orientated at a slight upward angle. Apply thread sealer to the male side of the reducer. Install this into the frontward fitting on the crossover block. Snug it down and then rotate an additional 1 to 2 turns. Apply thread sealer to the tapered threads on the oil feed adapter fitting. Install this into the reducer fitting. Tighten it in the same manner as the other NPT fittings. Be sure and hold the reducer with another wrench to keep it from rotating. Thoroughly clean the sending unit and apply thread sealer. Install this into the top of the crossover block. Tighten it down and then reconnect the electrical connection. At this point, you can either install a 90-degree oil filter adapter or machine down the fitting. If you're knocking down the fitting, be sure you don't take too much off. Either or is needed, along with a shorter oil filter to properly clear the driver's side manifold. Reinstall the fitting and or 90-degree adapter. Test fit the shorter oil filter. We utilized a Wix filter with a part number of 51311. That completes the mock-up of the hot side piping. Now it's time to mock up the cold side and intercooler. The intercooler placement will depend primarily on the orientation of the cold side piping. The instructions illustrate the orientation of the cold side piping. Before continuing, remove the factory installed power steering cooler tube. This car has a manual rack conversion, so we won't be installing the one On3 provides. If you need to install the provided tube from On3, now is the time to do so before mocking up the intercooler. Assemble the cold side tubing and secure it with the provided silicone couplers and clamps. Leave the clamps loose so you can make adjustments as they're needed. Once the tubing is in place, we had to modify the fan shroud to clear the tubing as well as enlarge the access hole in the passenger side fender apron. A piece of 1/4-inch vacuum hose can add to the overall finished look of the opening. At this time, you can support the intercooler and connect both of the cold side connecting tubes. All in all here, the cold side went together really well. LX bumpers will have to be cut around the lower opening. GT owners will need to modify their fog light bracket and/or the attaching hardware for the bracket. In our situation, we not only had to cut the lower opening in our LX bumper cover, but we also had to modify the header panel to clear the top portion of the intercooler. This was pretty straightforward, just a little time consuming. A pneumatic body saw is highly recommended for this. Now that the bumper cover is modified to our liking and that it clears the intercooler and tubing, we can take measurements for our Pro-M blow-through meter. When doing this, you want to install the meter as far up on the tubing inside of the fender. Just be mindful to leave enough surface area to properly secure the silicone coupler. Measure the length of the meter and then mark each tube. Remove them from the car and cut each one at the mark. Either have a local shop add a bead to the edge of each tube, or take additional measurements and weld the ends of the tubing you just removed. Install the blow-through meter and source an additional 3-inch silicone coupler and 2 3-inch clamps. Check over the cold side piping and verify that none of the tubing is in contact with other components. This is the time to fabricate some brackets for the intercooler. We simply took some rectangular bar stock that we had laying around the shop and bent the ends. The correct hardware was sourced to attach the brackets to both the intercooler and the car. We secured it to the bottom of the core support and the top near the header panel support brackets. For the most part, that completes the cold side mock-up. You can now mock up the downpipe and On3 Y pipe. On our 88 coupe, the AC accumulator bracket had to be tweaked in order to fit the downpipe. You can also remove the bracket altogether if you run into this as well. You will need help from a friend for the next few steps. Install the downpipe and loosely tighten a V-band clamp. You can now mock up the On3 Y pipe. You will need help from a friend for the next few steps. From underneath the car, assemble the Y pipe and loosely tighten the connections with the provided V-band clamps. Before connecting the cat back, verify that the downpipe from the turbine is not contacting the body of the car or the bell housing. Tighten the V-band clamp at the turbine. From here you can manipulate the Y pipe and ensure that it's nice and tucked under the body of the car. Connect the cat back and verify the piping is not hanging too low. For our application, we are not going to be utilizing the exhaust dump section, so at this time, we installed the provided gasket and block-off plate. With the turbo in place, check for clearance of the upper radiator hose. You can trim down the factory hose or source another hose that has different bends to better clear the compressor. At this time, you also need to tweak the AC hoses if you are going to be retaining air conditioning. Now is the time to double and triple check all of the hot side and cold side piping. Once you feel good about it, disassemble the hot and cold side piping, but leave the intercooler in place. You're finally ready for final assembly. Per On3, they have found that high temp RTV works best to seal the manifolds to the cylinder heads. If you would like to take this route, apply a bead of high temp RTV to the flange on both manifolds. Apply anti-seize to all 16 of the manifold retaining bolts. Position the passenger side manifold into place. Start one of the center bolts and thread it in a few turns. Let the manifold sit at an angle so that the RTV doesn't contact the cylinder head. Start the rest of the bolts and then gradually thread them in by hand. Once the manifold is seated, fully tighten the bolts. Repeat these steps for the driver's side, but don't forget to leave the dipstick retaining bolt loose so that you can reinstall the dipstick. At this time, you can reinstall the dipstick back into the engine block and then fully tighten the bolt. It is going to be in your best interest to protect the plug wires with high temp boots. We opted to do this as well as install some harness sleeve to keep the plug wires grouped together. Reconnect all of the plug wires to their respective spark plug. You should have numbered these when you remove them if they weren't already numbered. Verify that all of the plug wires are free of the manifolds. Install the rest of the hot side piping and fully tighten the V-band clamps. Place the turbo and gasket onto the manifold. Install the retaining hardware and loosely tighten as there is some adjustability with the turbo. We did end up sourcing our own hardware for this. Slide the oil drain hose over the fitting in the oil pan. Secure both ends of the drain hose with clamps. Install the downpipe onto the turbine and loosely tighten the V-band clamp. Assemble all of the cold side piping, silicone couplers, and fully tighten all of the clamps. From underneath the car, ensure that the downpipe is not in contact with the car or the bell housing. Tighten the V-band clamp. Fully tighten the turbo to manifold retaining hardware. While you're here, be sure and tighten the turbine and compressor clocking bolts. Reassemble the Y pipe and connect it to the existing cat back. Place the blow-off valve, boost controller, wastegate, and the associated hardware on a workbench. Install the fitting into the blow-off valve utilizing the banjo bolt and crush washers. Do not tighten the bolt at this time. Moving to the boost controller, apply thread sealer to all of the fittings. The two barbed fittings will install in line with one another and they'll be orientated in the direction of the arrow. The two plugs will install in the other two openings. We colored the arrow red so that it was visible on camera. Tighten all of the 4 fittings. Clean off any residual thread sealer. Moving to the wastegate, install one of the supplied fittings with 2 crush washers onto the top port of the wastegate. Do not fully tighten the banjo bolt at this time. Remove the lower clamp and discard the adapter ring. However, make note of the firing ring. This has to be installed. On3 recommends lubricating it with some white lithium grease. Once that is done, you can install the wastegate onto the hot side pipe and loosely tighten the clamp. Rotate the wastegate so that you can access the dump tube. Position the dump tube and then fully tighten the clamp. Leave the wastegate as is, and we will come back to it later on in the video. Now you can pick a location for the boost controller. We're mounting ours on the passenger side fender apron near the turbo. You can mount this wherever you like, and On3 does provide self-tapping screws to mount this. Remove the lock collar from the controller and position it through the opening in the bracket. Make note of the arrow. This is the flow of vacuum. It will lead to one of the side ports on the wastegate, which we will get to momentarily. Reinstall the collar and tighten it down. Uncap the port labeled B/R on the vacuum tree. Install a short piece of the provided vacuum hose. Secure the hose with a zip tie if you'd like. Install a long piece of vacuum hose over the T-fitting leading toward the passenger side of the car. Run the hose alongside the firewall. Then run it alongside the electrical connection that passes over the strut tower. You can also pass this into the fender well if you so choose. Cut the hose to length and then install it onto the fitting on the boost controller. Now install the hose onto the fitting on the other side of the controller. This is the side with the arrow. Feed the hose down to the wastegate. This time you can clock the wastegate and position the dump valve away from other components. We found that facing the dump valve toward the rear of the car and at a 45-degree angle work best. Tighten both of the clamps to fully secure the wastegate and dump valve. The top port on the wastegate will serve as a vent. Simply install a piece of the vacuum hose onto the fitting and then secure it with a zip tie. Attached to the other end was a small fuel filter intended for a lawnmower. This will keep dirt and debris from entering the wastegate. Orientate the fitting and then fully tighten. Following that, we install the other fitting onto one of the side ports on the wastegate. Either port is fine. The open port was capped utilizing the small plug provided in the kit. The vacuum hose coming from the boost controller will plug into the fitting on the side. Secure it with a zip tie and then fully tighten the bolt. The wastegate is now good to go. Back at the T-fitting at the vacuum tree, install a piece of vacuum hose over the barbed fitting. Secure it with a zip tie. This will lead to the blow-off valve on the cold side tubing. Once connected to the T-fitting, feed the hose alongside the cruise control vacuum hose if equipped. This hose leads to the driver's side fender. Once inside the fender, we chose to run this alongside the windshield washer hose. It was secured with zip ties. Position the blow-off valve onto the cold side tubing. Orientation of the BOV does not matter, so you can fully tighten the clamp. Rotate the fitting so that the vacuum hose can easily be installed. Slide the vacuum hose over the fitting and then secure it with a zip tie. Fully tighten the banjo bolt. Per the On3 instructions, the plus sign on the controller will decrease boost and the minus sign will add boost. To adjust this, pull up on the cap and rotate in the direction of the plus sign. Do this until it will no longer rotate. Push down on the cap to lock it into place. At this time, run over all of your vacuum hoses one more time to ensure they are secured to all the fittings and properly tucked out of the way. To install the alternator and the relocation bracket, first loosen and remove the necessary stud and bolt from the water pump. Reference the image in the instructions for proper placement of the bolts and spacers. Mock up the assembly first. Apply anti-seize to all of the hardware. This includes the threads and shoulders on the bolts. The rod ends on the turnbuckle will be side specific. One is standard thread and the other is reverse thread. Run out the jam nuts and then thread each rod end all the way into the turnbuckle until they stop. Install the bracket and hardware, but leave it loose. Pull the long bolt back and remove the spacer. Position the alternator into place and reinstall the spacer and bolt. In our situation, the alternator made contact with the heater return hose. Remove the hose, cut it, and then reinstall it. Reinstall the alternator and check for clearance. Fully tighten the hardware. Install the turnbuckle along with its associated hardware and spacer. We reused the 3/8" coarse thread nut from the smog pump to retain the rod end to the AC bracket. To determine belt length, use a piece of string. Feel free to reference our video in the description on how to do this. Belt length is going to vary depending on everyone's setup. Route the belt and then rotate the turnbuckle until proper belt tension is achieved. Now we can begin buttoning up a few of the smaller things. Take the provided stainless oil supply hose and thread it onto the top fitting on the turbo. Since this is a convex seat fitting, thread sealer is not needed, so just tighten it down. We routed our line down the backside of the alternator. Install the line onto the fitting at the sending unit and tighten. Again, no thread sealer is needed. If you have to, clock the sending unit and then secure the supply hose to the starter cable. While you're in the area, properly secure any other hoses and/or lines away from sensitive areas. Apply anti-seize to the O2 sensors and install them into each manifold. More than likely, you'll need to run O2 extensions because of how far forward the sensors are now positioned. If you're running a wideband, install the sensor into the bung on the downpipe. Plug in the mass airflow connection and any other electrical connection that was disconnected. Drain the oil since you had to tap the pan for the turbo drain. Pre-soak the filter media in the new oil filter and install it. Add fresh oil to the engine and replace the cap with the screw-in breather. These are available on our site. Use some vacuum caps to cap off the oil fill tube and throttle body ports. Install the upper radiator hose and top off the coolant if you had to remove some. We're utilizing an On3 air filter for the turbo compressor. Reconnect the AC lines if you remove them. Of course, be sure and have the system recharged after installation. If you're upgrading the fuel components, go ahead and get that done. Now is the time to run back over everything and double check all of your work. Start the car and let it idle. It's normal to see smoke for several minutes after startup. Once you feel comfortable with everything, contact your local tuner and set up a date to have the car tuned. In our case, we simply made a few tweaks to our Pro-M dedicated ECU to run this turbo.
All right, everything is dialed in. The car idles great, it revs clean, and more importantly, we don't have any leaks or additional headaches. Now, we did briefly drive the car around to confirm that all of our work is A-OK. Now, it's time to get this thing back on the dyno and see what we can expect from the On3 Turbo Kit at 6 pounds of boost and, of course, 93 octane fuel. Taking a look at the graph, the car made a very impressive 371 horsepower at 5,200 RPMs and 403 foot-pounds of torque at 4,000 RPM. Now, that's pretty damn good considering the mild bolt-on that the car has and a very conservative 6 pounds of boost. Now, if you overlay the two graphs, you'll find that peak gains were 121 horsepower and 119 foot-pounds of torque, with just as good or better gains throughout the entire curve. Now, a couple of things that we did do while we were in the middle of the install was vacuum the AC system so that we could disconnect our AC lines from the condenser. This was done so that we could properly clock and manipulate these lines to clear the turbo. We did end up making a few trips to the hardware store, but that's par for the course when installing a budget-friendly turbo kit. Remember guys, every setup is going to be a tad bit different in terms of the overall fitment. Now, there are countless number of variables that will affect this. What we showed in the video is a very good general understanding on how one of these kits goes together. All in all, I think it's time for my honest feedback on this kit. For the money, this is a really good turbo kit for a Fox Mustang. Like I said before, it's only as good as its installer. I mean, you can take a few days to put it on, or you can take several months to dial everything in to its last detail. Of course, for the most current pricing and product information on this kit, be sure and check out lmr.com. To see more how-to and review videos covering industry-leading products, be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, and don't forget to turn on notifications. While you're at it, check out our other videos, and you know what to do by now for all things 1979 to present Mustang, and of course, SVT Lightning. Keep it right here with the real enthusiasts, lmr.com.